Okay. I'm Matt Varghese. I'm a software developer on the Epic payer side of things. So I work primarily on payer utilization management software, and I'm interested in the whole DaVinci ecosystem aspects.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. I think everyone knows me from the last call. Otherwise, so does somebody want to do an introduction from the Cambia Multicare side, just so Matt has got a little bit of context too?
Hi, Matt. This is Dave DeGandy. I think we know each other already. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, I think we have talked on the calls and other places. Yeah.
Have you?
Go ahead, Heidi.
Hey, you guys, this is Heidi, Chris. Sorry I was late. I was in another meeting. Are we just doing hello and who we are?
Yeah, so this is basically the gang that we had together for the first call. Plus, we've got Matt from Epic. So I figured for Matt's sake, it'd be good to do intros.
Okay. Hey, Matt. So I'm an assistant director here at Cambia. I lead our medical policy area and a lot of the prior authorization decisions, and then also leading many of our transformation efforts in the PA space. Yeah, I'll just stop there. There's a lot of different initiatives going on.
Yeah, I think I've met you at a previous call we had too.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Cool. Anyone else who maybe hasn't met Matt that wants to jump in with a quick intro?
I can go finish out the Cambia folks. Amol Vyas, Chief Architect at Cambia, focusing on interoperability. Basically, deal with interop sorts of things, including Karen Alliance. I'm technical lead on the Karen Blue Button implementation guide. Also dabble with DaVinci use cases and other community-based efforts as and when they happen, and I get to join them. Happy to be here to talk about the interesting scenarios and use cases with respect to payer-provider interaction. Hopefully, what we do here will push the needle on interoperability with respect to payer-provider interaction and burden reduction in a big way.
Cool. Anyone else with intros? All right, so on our last conversation, we talked at a very high level about what prior authorization workflows are like, who are the actors involved, what are the workflows that typically play out in real life exchanges. And I think the truth there was that there's still a lot of faxes and manual back channel coordination that happens. And then we talked a little bit about some of the DaVinci specifications that are aiming to provide kind of a FHIR-based set of implementation guides for automating more of these. And that left us with some questions. So Amol had followed up with an email really asking about what he characterized as writing back data to the EHR, for example, to track the status and various attributes of a prior authorization request. So I'm going to do a quick screen share and just sort of set what I think is the sort of scope of this discussion. Not necessarily because it's right, but just because it's concrete. And then Amol, please dig in and correct me, especially where I've made mistakes. This is the best opportunity that I've got to learn where my metal is a little broken. So I'll paste in the link to this doc in the chat as well, where you can see at the top of the screen here. But so this was just notes from the meeting invite. In our last call, we heard from the team at Multicare that there was a set of data associated with prior authorization requests sort of managed inside of their Epic dashboard or queue, where to close out a request in that queue, today a human being, like a person on the auth team, would go request by request and somehow make sure that all this information was captured. And sometimes this might be coming through, I assume, like a fax. Sometimes it might be coming from a web portal or even a DaVinci dedicated app. But today there's a human sort of closing the loop on each of these data elements, if I understood right, and that was a source of potentially error and also just unnecessary time for people to spend trying to copy information back and forth when this could be a target of automation. So at least the way that I understood it from the last conversation and piecing together some of these specs from DaVinci, I wanted to see if we could talk about eliminating those kinds of manual steps from a workflow. I think this is something that the DaVinci specifications already contemplate, but maybe the details aren't all there, or maybe they're a little bit hard to surface from inside of those specs. In particular, there was a question about whether we model this kind of workflow as an external app writing data into the EHR, and I'm personally agnostic on that. I think we could construe it that way to say we just need a way for an external app to write the date received with a prior auth request. And David, give me 1 second, and then I will switch over to you. So that would be one framing, would be around apps writing. Another framing could be a third-party application or a payer-run service just sort of returning this information to the EHR as part of a workflow, where the EHR could then pick it out and maintain it where and how it needed to. And so that would sort of shift some of the data writing responsibilities into the EHR and focus on communicating the various elements as part of our workflow. So I just want us to sort of talk about the trade-offs involved in those decisions. And then with that in mind, at least here's kind of the flow chart that I have in my head for how the DaVinci specs are designed today. I don't know that this separation between CRD and PAS makes like obvious and intuitive sense, but I'm going to take it on faith, at least for this discussion, that that's how things are layered. And then so in the DaVinci context, there's initially a request that more or less asks, is prior authorization needed? And that's kind of a CRD request at first, when a clinician might be going to make an order. If the answer is no, prior auth isn't needed, the CRD request might return something to that effect. And there's been some ongoing discussion in the CRD community chat about whether that thing is a card with a button that a user can click to sort of save that information, or maybe better still, if that could be a CDS hooks system action that the EHR could simply automatically read and associate that result, that fact that no prior auth is needed. But wherever that information sort of comes back in the CRD response, the EHR presumably is going to store something about that. And I don't know that we've talked a lot about what details need to be stored in that case. So I'm going to put a question mark there. We might want to dig into that question in this discussion. And if the answer is yes, prior auth is needed, I think something happens to kick off a PAS request. I'm not yet clear on whether that something involves a human in the loop making decisions and setting variables, or whether that is just purely automated. I'd love to learn more on that front. But either way, once that request is submitted, there's some sort of pending response perhaps for a time, and then ultimately it resolves to a approved or not approved, possibly with more back and forth in the loop here. My sense has been it would be most impactful for us to focus on the workflows that can be fully automated and make sure that we've got a really good story for like getting to yes. And maybe there's still some out-of-band steps in cases where we can't automatically get to yes, but that's just sort of a proposal based on what I've heard so far about where we might want to focus. And then at the end of this, if we do get to a yes, what are the data elements that the EHR needs to log and store again? And I think those maybe come back to the initial data list that we heard from the last call. So that's my sort of quick view about what I think are some of the steps involved and some of the questions. And let me turn over to David, who raised his hand, and see where we are. Oh, David, you're on mute.
So I think what we should add into your list that you have here is the right back of the letter of determination that is sent to the providers right now. And Heidi can tell more, has more details on around that than I do, but.
Cool. So sorry, that's the letter of determination. I'll put that in the list of elements we're talking about here for sure.
Yep, cool.
So thoughts on this framing overall? Am I asking the right questions, or are these the areas we want to talk about for the next 40 minutes?
I think that was a great level set, Josh. What I'd like to do is maybe share a very high level picture that I always think of when I'm thinking about the prior authorization business use case, right? And this picture kind of explains it to me. Hey, this is how the conversation happens or the interaction happens. And I like this because each of these interactions, and there's 3 if you're seeing my screen, they correspond roughly to the 3 IGs or the 3 APIs that are involved in the workflow that you just talked about. The first one being an interaction between the provider and the payer, which is basically the question whether coverage or prior authorization is needed. And that basically sets the stage for the later interactions. If the prior authorization is needed, then the provider payer interaction involves getting the documentation together based on certain collection of clinical data. And so the first API is basically the CRD API that you just referenced in your workflow. The second interaction in the case prior authorization is or may be required. That interaction is the DTR, documentation templates and reports. Is that Dave and Heidi? Correct me if I'm wrong, because you've done this. Rules. There you go.
Yep.
And so these are basically the business rules stored on the payer side or on behalf of the payer for the payer to basically make a determination of, hey, what sort of documentation might be required to basically prepare for the filing or submission of a prior authorization request. And so the second interaction is basically collecting the data to prepare the documentation as part of the prior authorization submission. And this DTR is basically an interaction that's currently handled by the MCG sub app. It's an app within an app or an app called from the main Cambia Smart Auth app, which basically accesses the business rules and other documentation requirements stored for Cambia within the MCG system, because MCG is our vendor for the prior authorization.
Well, if it's possible for this conversation, I'd like to set that piece of the equation aside. Just put a box around it and say, that's interesting, it's complicated, but we might not need to standardize it first. Is that fair?
Yep, absolutely. So great point. And so after that step, when we have the required documentation ready on the Smart Auth app running on the EHR, the third interaction is basically the core prior authorization submission interaction, where all that documentation that's prepared with the clinical data that was fetched as part of the second interaction is packaged with the actual prior authorization submission, transaction submission. And we can go deeper into this, but basically this goes to the payer, and the payer basically responds with an ACK, and this starts off a chain of business kind of activities or business workflow within the payer side. There are further interactions, introspecting into the status of a prior authorization, resulting in the determination on that prior authorization request. And this is where I think our landing the prior authorization details into the EHR kind of work kind of focuses. Any questions or comments on what I just kind of talked about? Does everyone kind of see our focus where it should be in this third interaction?
So I mean, I would like to understand touch points with the EHR. That's maybe how I would frame it. I think there's one that happens at the very top of this chart. And in the best case, that's all that happens. I think like that's the simplest possible case is like, I don't need prior auth because the payer knows what's going on. They've got all the information they need to know that this is fine, and they just return this is fine. So if we can make sure that that works as much as possible, like that seems like the narrowest target for interop, and so we shouldn't lose sight of that one. That's the best workflow, I think, just because it's so short. And then at the bottom of this diagram, yeah, I'd love to understand what it means to initiate and close out a prior auth request in a way that the EHR can understand and track, and particularly what are the touch points that the EHR needs to directly support in order for that to play out.
And the CRD standard does also support an actual PA submission and payer returning a approved authorization, only staying within the CRD use case.
So for CRD, let's start there then, if that's all right, and let's just make sure that at least I've got a handle on the scope there. I've got the CRD. Let me just open up the CRD spec. I think I've got it in a background tab here, and did my screen share? Let me try that one more time. Okay. So
there you go. Yep.
On the CRD spec, I know. So first of all, let me just say there's this open JIRA issue, which I think is really important about this key workflow question on CRD. So that's issue 37484 in the tracker, which is all about, does this information get surfaced in a card with a button that the user has to click to do stuff? Or does this information get surfaced in a way that the EHR can automatically just understand it and work with it without the user needing to take extra steps? I think there's been some debate or at least discussion on Zulip about these points. And I think it's worth checking for the folks on this call. Are there folks with a strong opinion one way or the other on this issue?
I mean, so sorry, this is Graham Peterson from Epic. I work with Kyle often, and he's out on vacation. So yeah, I'm here kind of as his backup. Yeah, we feel kind of strongly that we've met with a number of provider groups, and they want to be able to essentially have this kicked off and not be in front of their face.
Yep.
So whether or not that means that the alternative therapies ends up being a like more true or more ideal CDS hooks implementation, right? Where it's not necessarily prior auth, but more of, hey, I need to query a group of third parties, maybe my payer involved, and respond with, hey, what decision support do I need? Maybe some part of that involves saying, hey, the one that you want is not going to be approved for PA. You should consider these other things. But trying to separate out the true, did I get auth for this thing as a true admin system kind of action? So a backgrounded, right, kind of async, ideally, from their perspective, flow of, yeah, do I need authorization? We did get interesting feedback, though, that does counteract that, I will say. If we did get an immediate response that said, hey, you were denied PA for some reason, that they would want to be able to communicate with the patient of, hey, I may need to follow up with your insurance. You may be liable for this. Not sure what the exact workflow would be for what they end up doing once they get that denial, because I think it varies based off organization. But yeah, we did hear kind of a patient engagement step on the denial front.
Yeah, and so Graham, thank you for joining, and thank you for the perspective. I think that is a really compelling set of considerations myself. And I'll say that those two perspectives that you brought, one about, hey, let's make sure we automate this so that we don't have extra steps for the clinician, but also let's make sure there's a touch point for patient engagement. I don't see those as contradictory, actually. I could imagine a story where we say the right way to return approvals and denials at the CRD stage is with a system action. And if it's an approval, the EHR can log that fact and, print a little happy face on the screen and move on. Print a little happy face in the corner without taking up the clinician's time or attention. And if it's a rejection, the EHR can read that fact from a system action just as well and surface it to the clinician however they see fit. I guess the real question is like, if you think there's important language that the payer would need to surface, a clinician-facing message, then we're maybe in the space of wanting to return a card. But if it's just a fact that the EHR can see and interpret, like, hey, the insurance company's not ready to get to yes on this yet, I think a system action with the appropriate extension saying, no, this is not going to be covered would be enough for the EHR to then flow into the right downstream workflow of patient engagement. Does that check for you?
Mostly. I will say there's one piece that I want to, I'm not sure what the right language is to use, but I would encourage that we use, which would be kind of returning denial reasons, right? Or it's trying to make it very clear in a discrete way, right, to the provider and to any system that we have in the EHR that might be checking for these discrete things to surface it appropriately. Right, discrete reasons. So we need a peer-to-peer to happen in order to approve that PA. We need, additional clinical documentation from the from your PCP who is not here. You're seeing a specialist. I don't know. There's other reasons that are sometimes codified in the X12 spec, sometimes not, as others on the call probably know. But yeah, the reason there being very important.
And that set of denial reasons, I loud and clear hear you that it's important to surface some computable, clear explanation of why. Are those explanations of why, are those shared between this CRD step? Like if we get to, no, sorry, we need a peer-to-peer conversation, and let's imagine that's one code in a taxonomy of 20 reasons that could be possible. Would that set of 20 reasons be the same here in this CRD step as it would be later on in this PAS step?
I think there's going to be significant overlap. I don't know that it's exactly the same.
Okay, great.
And is there shared agreement between payers and providers on what are common reasons even is a question I will ask.
A common reason for a peer-to-peer, is that what you're asking?
No, I mean, is there generally some terminology which defines what are common reasons why claims are, why prior authorization requests are approved or why prior authorization requests are denied, etc. The best we have seen probably is X12 codes, but not all of them are, or I don't know that is the exhaustive list of every reason for denials.
We have reasons, but I don't know about in X12, but we do have reasons for denials, but they're very high level. So they're not granular.
That granularity and also the variability across organizations.
Right. That's the other thing I was going to say is I think every health plan is going to report out differently, right, from their systems. So it would vary largely health plan to health plan.
Everybody's going to make up their own version of the message kind of thing.
So, I mean, I'm going to capture this for now as, targets for future standardization, specific list of reason codes for denial.
Yep.
And I think that a good CRD publication would have something to say about this, even if it was just 2 or 3 really high-level reasons. And if providers wanted to pick the one of those that kind of describe the category of reason and then supply their own more detailed or organization-specific reasons, doing even a little bit here could be very valuable from what I understand so far.
Yes.
Yeah, Graham just posted the X12 reason code list to the chat.
Awesome. And if you want to put that in there, you should have edit access on this share doc too. I will drop it in afterwards. Otherwise, will I be able to download these things? Oh yeah, so these are things like not medically necessary, requires medical review. So I guess, the question is, great, should that be the list? Do we need to augment that list, or would we need to start with a new effort to define a different list?
So that's a great question and something we've been trying to talk through with some of our provider groups like Multicare around should we be categorizing these, right? We have denial reasons and we also have errors, and oftentimes we get inconsistent results from payers on which group or which which taxonomy set to use. So do they return a AAA error that says this PCP is not valid, when instead they needed to send back a denial reason of 0E, provider is not the primary care physician. Right? And so we see inconsistent kind of mixing and matching between these two sets of things. And so clear guidance on what is an error and what is a denial. And yeah, how do you separate those? Seems like errors should be more technical or communication related to me, but that's maybe it needs a more nuanced look on like what does that mean.
And again, for the errors, I want to make sure this is in scope for CRD. If I understand right, CRD is like Dr. Jones is planning to order, X study or X treatment or refer for XYZ procedure. The CRD request itself, I assume, doesn't have as much information as a prior auth request would. It's not like formally breaking down a set of these parameters and supplying them. Is that right? And if so, are there some of these errors that still would apply in that CRD context?
So
That is,
it's a good question. Sorry, I'll let Dave go. Sorry.
I would say, yes, that is correct, that CRD will commonly be, if it's able to make the determination from CRD, it's going to be a simpler one that requires less data and not so complicated to where a policy enforcement and DTR was needed to really get to the medical necessity evidence.
And I would just tag on. Oh, sorry, Dave, go ahead. I thought you were done.
Go ahead, no, please.
Oh, I was just going to tag on to what you said. So in CRD, you're essentially doing a PA and eligibility check. Do they have benefits, and does that service require prior auth? I'm looking at this reason code list, and these are great. This is a great start. I think some of these are not relevant at the CRD phase, but they are at the DTR phase. So I think you need reason codes for CRD. Does it even require review, and does the patient have benefits? And then you need a reason code list when you get to the DTR phase, which is typically getting more to medical necessity and clinicals, which is a different reason code list.
There is one part I want to kind of expand our conversation there on, like the simplicity of CRD, and it's around the performing provider and the performing details. So if we kind of break down like what is an auth, so you've got kind of the person on the other end who you're talking to, right? The payer often. You've got your service, you've got a date range, and you also have some performing details. So what's the dates, where's the location, right? Which provider is it? A lot of these denial reasons, right? When the physician is placing that order, they can say, I want to refer you to, John Smith over at cardiology, but they can also leave that out. That was actually why, or one of the reasons why some of the language going toward order sign versus order select was something that we preferred, because that performing provider was not always known. And so then the next layer of questions comes to, why do you care about the performing provider? Well, I guess it goes back to the definition that was just given about, like, am I doing a PA check, an eligibility check, and a network check or not? So if I'm doing a network check to say this provider is a network or this provider is gold carded, then that may be part of the calculus of is PA required or not.
And we do have that built into our process, because we do have a gold card program, and we can actually tell the provider based on their gold card and their PA check if they have to submit PA or not.
And Heidi, just to double check there, the ordering provider would get a message based on the proposed recipient of the referral, based on whether that recipient was gold carded. Is that right?
So the gold card, the way we have it set up today is, we're still refining it as we go along. The way we have it set up today is a pilot where we can choose to gold card the ordering provider and the rendering provider, or just the ordering provider. So there's combinations. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but yeah.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. And you're giving me vocabulary too, ordering and rendering.
Yeah, so we do both. And in our EOF CRD step, they have to submit both to us. Who's ordering and who's rendering, and where is it happening?
And that is consistent with our investigation too, that there is interest in that gold carding to be based both on the provider who's ordering as well as the performing provider.
Yep.
Okay.
And just for Josh, rendering and performing are the same.
Rendering and performing, yes.
Yes.
I will try to get my language straight, both in a written doc and when I speak. So thank you for that too, because you can tell this is new territory for me. So this is really good. And so I think there's.
Before we go too far, there's one other thing I wanted to circle back on. You touched upon, should it be a card that pops up or should it be a discretely understandable thing to the EHR? That is one we should highlight because in prior auth, there is a lot of discrete codable information that the payer system furnishes and the provider system wants to get in that discrete fashion. You are instrumental in the CDS hook specification. You obviously know we go with that pop-up where the language is driven by the CDS service because it can be all over the place and what is the information that is being shown, what are the actions, etc. But in prior authorization and determination, this is a very limited set, right? The kind of things, this is codifiable, and we want to get that codifiable information from one side to the other. So that objective is also something we really should keep in mind of. As much as possible, the reasons should be brought back to the EHR in a codifiable and computationally understandable fashion.
Yeah, so Matt, I think we're on the same page there. Just to say it explicitly, if we make this change to the CRD spec that's outlined in, I think Kyle created this issue, yeah, issue 37484, then rather than just returning a card with text and a button, the payer would be returning a system actions array that the EHR could automatically understand, interpret, and act on without having to pop anything up in front of the user or even display anything non-modally to the user. The EHR would be totally in charge of what to do with this information. Does that make sense? Is that fair? Am I missing something?
Correct. That is all accurate, but also that even within the data that is returned inside of the system actions, we want more and more of the things being codified rather than just textual.
Perfect. So that's what I want to dig into now is at the CRD stage, sort of in my original diagram here, there's this question, if CRD says no prior auth is needed, please forgive my weird labels, but this is what this box means. CRD is giving me an answer that is all I need to know. What's in there, what details are present, how are they coded, and what is the EHR expected to be able to do with it? That's maybe the first, and given where we are in the timing today, maybe that's the only question we should try to tackle next, and we can do a follow-up call to think about some of the other question marks in this workflow. What I've heard so far in terms of what goes into that CRD response is it's really important to have codable reasons for why not, if the answer is no. So I got that. I've heard that it's important, and now actually I want to break this down into request versus response. I've heard that it's either important or maybe even necessary for the CRD request to contain information about several things. And maybe this is all written down in CRD already, and we don't need to waste time going over it. We can just refer to it, but maybe not. Let's take a look. The things that I think need to be in the request based on what we've heard so far is what's being ordered, who's the ordering provider, who's the rendering provider, and when. And maybe CRD already makes all this super clear. So if we go to the CRD spec and go to the, maybe it's the formal specification is what I should read. And then I'm talking about looking at the request profile in CRD. So this is sort of the CDS hooks request. There's a lot here. If somebody knows the part of the spec I should jump to, shout it out. So I think we're talking here about not encounters, or we're talking about orders, and particularly something like order select or order sign.
More order sign.
Yeah, so currently the way CRD is written, it doesn't say much under order sign, it just refers to order select. So for this conversation, I think let's just agree that what we're really talking about is the order sign hook. But let's look at the documentation that CRD provides here, which happens to be documented under order select. So at order select or order sign time, there's information, there's various relevant resources. So there's all kinds of orders, because the scope here could cover nutrition orders, referrals, meds, devices, or even requests that another provider transfer records. This one is a little bit hard for me to understand, but I'm going to set it aside for now because I don't think we need to worry about it too much. There are no constraints or special rules beyond the profiles expected to be used. So I'll say for me, this is sort of the challenging thing, is this spec is written in such a general purpose way to cover so many similar use cases that it can be hard to understand the details of something fundamental like, hey, I'm sending this patient for a cardiology consult, or I'm ordering a knee replacement or something. But I think we should be looking.
Josh, this is
Yeah.
actually one of the concerns we have also been having with the CRD spec, because
Yeah.
CRD spec assumes that because it is built on top of the CDS hook specification and because CDS hooks has a flexible prefetch, the CRD service can ask whatever it needs for its prior authorization request through that flexible prefetch framework, and therefore CRD does not need to codify the inputs that go into prior authorization determination. And this is where we have been differing, because we don't think that take from DaVinci is the best in terms of going forward with that specification.
Yeah, so I think that's probably fair. It's good to leverage the technical flexibility of CDS hooks, but we also want to document our assumptions. So even if the way that we support some of these requests is using very flexible infrastructure, the spec should be super clear and say, here's the things that EHR needs to support. And it should be like a finite list that, that we can actually agree is workable. But let me zoom into the service request profile, because I think this is going to be the most relevant, or one of the most relevant pieces for our discussion here. And this service request profile would have the details of, for example, the fact that I want to order a cardiology consult, I guess, or maybe, does anyone know what would be the best use case for the service request resource here?
Something like an imaging order seems reasonable.
Okay.
So it's like an MRI or
Cool.
CT.
So let's say this is an MRI that somebody's ordering. That's what's going to show up in this service request. And at the level of CRD, there's always going to be a status, which is draft, which is like, hey, this is the thing that I want to order, but I haven't ordered it yet. There's always going to be an ordered timestamp, and there's always going to be a requester, which is going to give us, at the very least, the NPI of the clinician who is making the request. And there's always going to be support for a performer, which is like that rendering provider. There might not be any, but the source system needs to support sending a performer if one is specified. And that, again, would be with the US core profiles, so at least an NPI for that rendering provider. And then there's always going to be this requested location, which I'm not sure what that is. It's the location where the procedure should happen. It surprises me a little bit that that is a mandatory field, because if I wasn't specifying who's going to do it, I certainly might not also be specifying exactly where. Even if I was referring you to Dr. Smith, he might work in like 3 different practices, and I don't know which one you're going to go to in 6 months when he's got a slot on one of his schedules. So that one is a little surprising. Otherwise, are there missing data elements that we know EHRs would need to support around these service requests, thinking about this profile? I mean, I think the real task is going to be, let's build some examples that use these resources for some real world use cases that we articulate, and then we'll see where it might break down. But if there's anything else that people can spot at this level, it's good to surface that.
I did want to ask the other payer friends on this this conversation, do you ever need coordination of benefits information, like whether or not you're primary or secondary for the performing date times?
Heidi? It's a good question, Heidi.
Let me ask. I can ping somebody and ask about that.
So far, I think the answer has been no. And from the feedback we've gotten when we asked, or very early on with our engagement with DaVinci, or sorry, with the burden reduction initiative, it was send the request to all payers. Right? You don't need to bother about whether or not it's primary or secondary. They'll need to respond either way.
That's what I think is what we do.
Okay.
Let me ask somebody, but I'm pretty sure that that is true for us.
While we're doing that, Josh, one other thing that we can cover at a later call, but delegated services is something that we should probably talk about at some point. I'm not sure if you already had that in scope or in your head, but where the eligibility or the utilization management work that happens is actually delegated from the payer to a third party. And so what's the response time expectation? What's the way to codify who to call when something goes wrong? And what does it change? Does it change anything with the spec?
Yeah, that's a great call out because we use AIM and Evicore, and we have a single sign-on through Availity. We don't have that in our DaVinci workflow, but through Availity we do. So if it requires review by them, we route them to their system.
Well, and really, we would like to have AIM and Evercore support the DaVinci APIs,
Yes.
so
Yes.
make it all stay in the Smart app.
Yeah, that's a great call out. Because there's a very significant volume going through both of those vendors.
For a ton of pairs. Yep.
Cool. And this is an area that I know so little about. I mean, I would love to think that the internal business decisions within a payer of where and how to delegate some of those responsibilities could be mostly opaque to a provider in the sense that they're clicking a link or calling a number or opening an app. And in theory, I would like to think that the provider wouldn't need to have a mental model of exactly how all that outsourcing was happening under the hood, but we should work through some of those examples because maybe that's not true.
Yeah, I also would love it if that were true, but what we're seeing in the real world is more of like when there is an issue, there's quite a challenge to actually surfacing what does that auth end user or that provider do in that case.
Yeah, and I could imagine that's especially frustrating for everyone involved.
Yeah.
And even if a payer would like to offer a delegated centralized framework where there is one endpoint for the payer and behind the scenes the payer forwards it to multiple endpoints, CRD does using CDS hooks kind of forms a constraint because you have a time limit on your turnaround time. You have to respond to a synchronous request.
A quick follow-up question. Apologies if this doesn't make any sense. Should we also be thinking about pharmacy pre-auths or prior auths? Because we have delegated adjudication as far as that as well. Using PBMs out there, pharmacy benefit managers.
From our last conversation, Brett asked a question like this, I think, in our last discussion, and the answer there was the underlying specs tend to be quite different. Like rather than bridging to X12, the critical questions might be, bridging to a set of NCPDP specifications for medication pre-auth. Now, it seems possible that a design like CRD could be agnostic to that fact. I'm interested in what folks think.
So on the payer side at Epic, we had some conversation around this. NCPDP is a spec that everybody wants to use, and I think it's required to use for that. So we, for instance, haven't tried to scope medications in our initial attempt at CRD, except for medications which actually are ordered as CPT J codes, which anyway falls under the normal UM review umbrella. There is interest in payers or some payers for getting that PBM back to in-house so that a spec like CRD could be used for that medication use case as well. We don't see anything at this point in CRD that will prevent something like that. so that we don't have a cause for concern, but we are not planning to dig too much into it on our side was how we had kind of left it.
And we're having those conversations right now, thinking about bringing the PBM back in-house and those reviews, and then trying to figure out how to integrate pharmacy into our more medical review process.
Okay, I mean, so what this says
the
to me
provider
is,
side, just from the provider side at Epic, we would love for clinicians to have a consistent experience.
Yeah.
It's mostly just a challenge of working through the nuance of, what legal things do we need to consider, what specs are available, how does that translation work, what kinds of response times and other constraints are we working under. If folks are much more reasonably going to respond within a certain amount of time to a prescription query than to a prior auth query. Yeah, anyway, a lot of the complexity is still there. We would love for the workflow to be the same though, if we could.
Sounds like that could be a future step, Josh, after we have ironed out some of the basic CRD kind of questions and concerns.
Yeah, I'm thinking about, what we should do next. So I'll say for me, I continue to feel like sort of a dilettante in this space, just sort of learning more vocabulary and learning more about the workflow. I am cognizant that DaVinci has regular calls on these topics, and there's spec editors who are working on these things. So this has been a really useful call for me, and I would probably continue to learn a lot and have more specific ideas if we did like 3 or 4 more of these. But I'm also wary about kind of stepping into the standards development territory that DaVinci is already covering well. So just for the folks here on this call today, what do you think? Is it worth it for this group to get together and continue discussions like this one? Or is there a way to sort of hand off the baton back into some of the DaVinci work groups? What do you think?
So is one of the goal coming out of this discussion to be able to do write-backs for status and the list of fields that we add? Is that was something that this team would work on? Building that?
Well, I mean, the question that Amol asked on the way into this call to me was, what do you think about write-backs? And my answer was, rather than talking about write-backs, let's just talk about what information the EHR needs to learn, and then different workflows that could cause the EHR to learn it. And I mean, my goal was really to have an approach that at least makes sense to me, so that we could advocate for that approach with the underlying specs. Like, I don't think we're going to roll up our sleeves and start writing any new specs, but if we had a shared understanding of what would be a good approach, we might be able to nudge things like CRD and PAS in that direction through our participation there.
Right. So I know Argonaut was working on a fire right project, correct?
So I mean, we had a project last year that was focused on generically fire rights, right. And Eric and I tried to pin this down, and I think we really struggled because writing is such a broad topic. We spent a lot of the year trying to pin down specific use cases, and frankly, we struggled with it. So this year, we had a project that was very, very focused to allow consumer apps to write up to 128 kilobytes of their own state into an EHR. So we picked something that was like really focused and where the data semantics were entirely up to the app, and the EHR didn't even need to understand it. And so like that's an example of a project that is scoped in a way that we've been able to, I think, succeed pretty well. But I think it's not helpful as a community just to think about write back, because it means so many different things in different contexts that it sets us up for failure when we get 3 months into a project that's about write back and nobody can agree on what write back is really about. So I'd love to see us describe the problem to be solved. And here, what I've heard so far is the problem to be solved is the EHR needs to know about prior authorization requests, understand their statuses, and be able to reflect those back to users. That's my problem statement, at least. And if folks feel like that's wrong, we should surface that too.
Right. And the reason I asked about fire right, I was wondering if there's a place for a utility that might help us get the functionality in place. But
I think the scale, performance, clinical safety implications of rights are going to vary dramatically across these different use cases. So I'm not saying we'll never get to some generic platform capability, but I think we're going to get there by solving a few specific problems and then looking at what we did.
Yep, totally makes sense. Thank you.
So, Josh, just as a suggestion, should we? I mean, it sounds like we're looking into the CRD specs, and perhaps we also look at DTR. Does it make sense? I love these sessions, by the way. Does it make sense for us to continue down this path, perhaps with the next session around a CRD kind of walkthrough, where we identify, hey, these are the points in the CRD spec where we could contribute, or we could, do something about it?
I would be happy to. I enjoy getting to talk through the specs at this level. I think if we do want to do a follow-up call, my homework assignment for someone, I would collaborate on this, but I can't lead it. My homework assignment would be, let's write an end-to-end example for each of the major workflows that we think CRD should support. Getting to yes, getting to no, show what all the inputs and outputs look like, because I think that will help drive a more concrete discussion about what might be missing.
I think that makes sense. Dave, do you think we could team up with a CRD tech lead to get to that point? I think we'll need a CRD tech lead, or is that Eric Haas for us, or
No,
what do you think, Dave?
So that the end goal of this, if we're looking for things that are missing, either in the request or response, shouldn't that be back on DaVinci to take care of that?
Yeah, I mean, my goal would be, let's work through an example. Let's see if we can produce an end-to-end example and put a little asterisk every time we needed to make an assumption, or every time we needed to break the data model. And then we can bring back that list of asterisks to DaVinci.
Right, so we're really testing the IGs then.
Testing might be a bit of a strong statement, but I would say reading them and trying to see what these actual payloads would be like.
Okay. Yeah,
and I would do it using the using the Jira issue that we looked at earlier with system actions, assuming that that's going to go through.
Yeah, Eric is not a lead on CRD. I think it's Lloyd is the technical CRD lead.
So, I mean, frankly, I think that it's okay if we do this project, or if we do this exercise without the spec editors involved. I think that'll give a good kind of cross check to see, can somebody who didn't write the spec understand it and figure out how it's supposed to work. That can be a useful kind of balancing function.
Right.
So if there's somebody on this call, send me a note on Zulip. I think if I hear from somebody who's interested in doing this, I'll collaborate with you on examples and we can schedule another call. I think that would be fun and it might be productive, but I also don't want to push. I know people's time is stretched very thin. So I want to make sure it's useful if we're going to spend the time on it.
This rough time of year with vacations and whatnot.
Yeah. So I'll let you all figure out how urgent this feels. If somebody reaches out to me, I will be happy to engage with you. If that happens soon, great. If it happens later, that's fine too. If it doesn't happen at all, I won't be offended.
That sounds like a good next step, Josh. Thanks.
Sure. All right.
Would you mind pasting that Jira ticket as well? In the chat? Would you mind pasting that Jira ticket in the chat?
Yeah, when I paste this video, I'll also include all the links in the Zoom chat, so it'll show up there.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, thanks, Brad. All right, thanks everyone. This has been a fun discussion.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you. Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.